So I was bicycling in my little hometown in near Boulder, Colorado at that time. And I went into a roundabout, one of those traffic circles, and I was basically T-boned from my right side by a woman who was driving a very large SUV, and she was texting while she was driving. I didn't know that, but I just saw as I was coming into where her road was hitting the traffic circle, I thought she was going to stop, but at the very last minute, it looked like she kind of floored it. So I didn't know what was going on. I was just in that moment focused on trying to survive. And she hit me, but somehow I ended up on the hood of her vehicle looking in at her. Like, kind of like one of these. I was thinking in my mind, hello, aren't you looking at me? Can't you see me? But she was so focused on her phone that she didn't see me looking back at her. And so she kept driving, and I was absolutely flabbergasted, but I was also terrified. There was that immediate feeling that this could be it. This could be how it all ends for me right here. So I slipped down the front of her vehicle and hit the pavement, and I was in between her front wheels. But as she rolled over me, then she was dragging me as she was driving. I'm underneath like this, being dragged underneath the vehicle. There was a voice that kind of came from everywhere through me. But this voice said, "This is your home. Welcome back home. You are a part of me. You're a part of us. Welcome home." And that's when I just wept, because I remembered just in that instant, that was our soul's reality, if you will. And this is but a temporary state of being. And that's when things began to shift. So I was bicycling in my little hometown in near Boulder, Colorado at that time, and just doing my normal errands around town on a bike. And if anybody knows the Boulder area, everybody does stuff on a bike. It's not unusual that people are out all year round. So I was out on January 3rd. It was a beautiful warm day, and I went into a roundabout, one of those traffic circles, and I was basically T-boned like this from my right side by a woman who was driving a very large SUV, and she was texting while she was driving. I didn't know that, but I just saw as I was coming into where her road was hitting the traffic circle, I thought she was going to stop, but at the very last minute, it looked like she kind of floored it. So I didn't know what was going on. I was just in that moment focused on trying to survive. And she hit me, but somehow I ended up on the hood of her vehicle looking in at her. Like, kind of like one of these. I was thinking in my mind, hello, aren't you looking at me? Can't you see me? But she was so focused on her phone that she didn't see me looking back at her. And so she kept driving, and I was absolutely flabbergasted, but I was also terrified. There was that immediate feeling that this could be it. This could be how it all ends for me right here. And she kept driving, and because I couldn't find anything to hang on to, I was just in that weird point on the hood of her vehicle I couldn't grab. So I slipped down the front of her vehicle and hit the pavement, and I was in between her front wheels, luckily. But as she rolled over me, it was something like out of a movie, almost like Indiana Jones. I actually got stuck on the underside of her vehicle. And then she was dragging me as she was driving. I'm underneath like this, being dragged underneath the vehicle. And talk about terror. I mean, I was absolutely terrified. But one thing did happen, which was the beginning of my sense that all is not as I thought it was in my whole life. So as I hit the pavement, there was a part of my consciousness that remained in my body. It was very animal. I call it the human body consciousness, very focused on survival, fear, terror, that whole everything that we would think of as far as what an animal might feel in that situation. But then at the same time, I noticed a part of me was outside of the accident, watching the whole thing, seeing things that I shouldn't have been able to see from under the car. I was watching that whole thing from 50 to 75 feet away as I was being dragged underneath. And it was that part of me that was outside. Some people call it the watcher, some people call it your soul. I don't know what to call it. I just know that that part of me was very calm and serene and very connected, I guess you might say, to the greater reality, and knew that this was going to be fine in the end. And there was a kind of a struggle that I had. There was that sense of everything's going to be just fine. It hurts now, but it will be fine. And then that me underneath the vehicle was like, no, this isn't okay. This is horrible. And that sense of what I call dual consciousness, being able to experience two levels of consciousness at the same time very distinctly, that lasted until the paramedics finally arrived. So what I saw from my outside perspective was that the guy that had been following her in another truck, just a bystander, drove around the traffic circle the opposite way to stop her because he had seen what happened. So he blocked her from continuing to drive and effectively saved my life. If he hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here. So he was able to stop the accident from continuing, or stop the crash from going on. And then he and probably a couple other people, from what I understand, called it into the police. Yeah. And the paramedics arrived fairly quickly after that. And luckily for me, there was a nurse on the scene who happened to be a trauma nurse, or at least she said she was a trauma nurse. And there was a trauma doctor at the scene as well. He was following me in another vehicle. So he was behind me and he saw the whole thing unfold. And he ended up being my doctor in the ER for the rest of the day. Wow. As well. So he followed me in. But I was so lucky to have all of that support and help right away at the scene. As the paramedics were working on me and I was feeling the body pain, I had that sense of both aspects of my consciousness coming back together. And I remember laying there on the pavement thinking, what the heck just happened? I didn't use the word heck, but what the heck just happened? What was all that? And I had no concept of what that could be, because first of all, as a scientist, I've been trained, your consciousness can't leave your body because it's produced by your brain, right? So that whole thing shouldn't have happened. But it did. That's where the weird stuff started. But for me, that's where my life really began to unfold in a beautiful way. I think it was going to be a hit and run. Once the woman got out, what I saw, because I was laying partially out from underneath of her vehicle at that time, and I was just kind of looking at her out of the corner of my eye. And she took one look at me, got back in the car and started it up like she was going to drive off. Wow. Like with me still underneath. And luckily, again, someone stopped her from going anywhere, but it was going to be a hit and run, I believe. What's really truly termed the near-death experience happened a couple days later. I was starting to question what I thought was reality. That was all it did. It was like, what in the world was that? That doesn't make any sense. But 3 days later, I ended up having to go into surgery to repair my spine, because my spine was, as you might imagine, busted beyond belief. The fact that I can now still walk is utterly amazing. My neck was broken in multiple places. My lower back was a mess. It was broken in multiple places. I shouldn't have survived the accident. But I was scheduled to go in for surgery on the following Monday. So this was a Friday. I went in on Monday, and I had what no one can really explain was a bad reaction to the anesthesia, which is weird because I'd had this anesthesia many times before when I've had regular surgeries. I've had a few other surgeries before and never had a reaction at all. But this time my heart stopped, my breathing stopped, my blood pressure went basically flatlined for somewhere between a minute and 2 minutes, which in the OR is a real long time. They don't like that happening. And what I experienced, though, I didn't know any of that. All I experienced was drifting off into unconsciousness because of the anesthesia. And then I woke up, which you're not supposed to do. And I woke up standing up. I looked down like, this isn't supposed to be happening. I was standing up on a hillside. And while it wasn't necessarily the land of milk and honey, it was definitely a different realm or a different part of reality or a bigger part of reality. And it wasn't really the visuals that were astounding to me, while they were. The energy, the colors, the sense of depth to everything around me. It wasn't just a tree that was in front of me. It was tree with many layers of energy, like coursing underneath of it. That wasn't the kicker. The kicker for me was feeling coming through me, like through my body, waves of love. It's the only term that I can come up with. Waves of love and acceptance and joy and peace and a welcoming. And that is what really woke me up. And I looked around. I remember distinctly looking around like, this isn't a bad place to be during surgery, because I was actually thinking that I was hallucinating at that point, even though you're not really supposed to be able to hallucinate while you're under anesthetic. I was thinking that it was a hallucination. But then I began to wonder if I died on the operating table, because I knew that this level of awareness shouldn't happen under anesthesia. And I thought, well, I must have died, because that's the only thing in my mind that could explain this. But then I thought, well, if I died, why am I here? Because I don't believe in any of this. I don't believe in anything after death, that death is it. And that's when there was I call it a voice, but it was a voice that kind of came from everywhere through me. But this voice said, this is your home. Welcome back home. You are a part of me. You're a part of us. Welcome home. And that's when I just wept, because I remembered just in that instant, that was our soul's reality, if you will. And this physical is but a temporary state of being. And that's when things began to shift, is when I remembered what my true home was. That's where things really opened up for me. And where I was really challenged, I still am to this day, but that's where the challenge began, the challenge to really embrace that here in this plane. That was my life's challenge, is to take all that I learned in the time after that voice welcomed me. I was there for what seemed like months, but I knew that the challenge would be to take that and come here with it.
Did you see any beings? Most people say there's a man who approaches them. Is it Jesus? Is it the Christ? He may not even say his name. Did you have that kind of encounter at all, of someone who's like, I'm the one who shows you around? Was that
I did. And I call her she, but I also know that was a cloak that she wore just for the time that she was with me. In fact, she said that, but I'll call her she. And later she explained that could use the name Mary, although she said don't put too much on that name. It's just a name that many have worn, and it's just as good as any, is how she put it. So it's just a name, which is why I often don't use it. But when she approached me, all I can say is she looked like a silvery spiritual being that was vaguely in a human, womanly form, with what appeared to be long hair, and she glowed. It was like this silvery glow that was coming off of her, and her garments, or her energy around her, looked like cloaks. But I knew, and she explained to me, that that was really just a form that she took in order for me not to get freaked out. Because as a human, I'm still partially in that human phase, because when you first take the first steps in leaving this body, you're still pretty well attached to it. There's a process of letting go of that attachment to the physical human self. And I was still pretty fairly attached to that physical human self. So there was still the potential to have fears come up, and all of them did everything they could to keep me from freaking out. So that meant the guide that came to me would be one that wouldn't be intimidating. I think if Christ would have shown up, or Buddha, or some bigwig would have shown up, I would have totally freaked out, because that wasn't my reality up to that point. I needed somebody that was kind of like me, that I could relate to. So what I saw was a woman who had an incredible connection to a group of beings beyond her, which were kind of like phased out of my sight. I knew that they were there with me. I could feel them. I could feel their thoughts occasionally. I could, like in here, not in here. not by my
Yeah.
ears, but in here. I could feel their emotions. I knew what they were feeling, but I couldn't communicate directly with them because, as they said, there are too many of us and only one of you, and you can't handle the amount of information that we could give to you all at once. So it was being filtered through this woman, this womanly guide of mine. And she acted as kind of the intermediary for this whole time that I was there. And effectively what it was a training session, and she was teaching me what I needed to take back
Mm-hmm.
to this life in order to make this life one that would be worthwhile for me and my family and my friends. So basically, to be the love that I wish to see in the world, to learn how to really do that, to be
Yeah.
present with that higher truth in this life, so I could just be an example of what that looks like. It isn't so much about telling people, it's also about being an example. And
Yeah.
so the next, what seemed like a couple of months, I mean, there wasn't really a passage of time because time is meaningless in that realm.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't a sense of that. But if I was to learn those same things here, it would take 2 or 3 months here. So she taught me some of the grander concepts of love and gratitude and connection, and how your thoughts and feelings and choices truly affect the world around you, not just the physical world, but also spiritually, how those spiritual vibes, if you will, go out, how everything that you do, every way that you show up in your life makes a difference. And it was all of those things together that really began the process of shifting. It's taken many years after that to fully bring it into my life, but that's when it began to really truly unfold for me. But to have that support, those 1,000 or so other beings, you could call them a soul family, you could call them soul friends. I call them my spiritual friends, but they're a group of like-minded or like-hearted spiritual beings that tend to support each other. And they were mine. You'll have yours, everybody has them, but they were mine, and they were there to support me and be with me during this time of my learning.